Hello and welcome to this February edition of our monthly learning series. Today our topic is grounded in humility. This year, our theme overall is our shared ministry in visiting the imprisoned. And we see this as a journey that reminds us that prison ministry is not just a special project for a few people, but it's a shared mission for the whole church. So during these first few months of the year, we're going to be exploring how we are all called to encounter Jesus in the imprisoned through our various ministries. I'm Father George Williams of the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, and I am also the Catholic chaplain at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center in California. As we know, encounters in jail and prison ministry often cross cultural lines of language, of faith, nationality, race, experience, gender. And this season, we're exploring how cultural humility is a vital posture for living out our shared mission to visit the imprisoned. And today, our guest speaker is a psychologist and Professor Miguel Gallardo. He brings his practical experience helping the church and state leaders navigate cultural differences with respect and empathy. And he's going to be offering us some concrete practices and reflection tools that we can immediately apply to our ministry. So before I introduce him more formally, let's pause for a moment and ask God's help and presence in our time today. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we thank you, Lord, for inviting us all into this ministry. We ask you to bless all those people that we are called to minister to and with. We pray for their families, for those who work in the prison system, for the victims of crime as well. Lord, we pray that we can have our hearts continually opened by your call to visit those in prison, to care for those who are marginalized, to welcome the aliens and the refugees in our midst. And Lord, especially in this time, I pray for your blessing on our country, that we can turn back to your call to do these things. And so we ask you, Lord, to be with us today and guide us with your presence. Bless all who are participating. And we make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. So Dr. Gallardo is a licensed psychologist and a professor of psychology and the director of Aliento. That's the Center for Latinx Communities at Pepperdine University. He's published in the areas of multicultural psychology, Latinx psychology, ethics and evidence-based practices, cultural humility, and racial and color-limited perspectives. He also serves on the Anti-Racism Education Committee for the ADLA and Anti-Racism Committee for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange, California. Dr. Gallardo is a fellow of the American Psychological Association. And just before we begin, I just want to let all of our live participants know today that we will have time for dialogue after Dr. Gallardo's initial presentation. And so at that time, if you want to ask a question, we'll invite you to write that in the chat box first, and then we'll call upon you to unmute, to share your question in person, or if you prefer just to have the question relayed to Dr. Gallardo by me, just indicate that in the chat feature. So again, welcome, Dr. Miguel. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Father George. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And, I hope that I can provide some, some foundational information that you can, and those present today can discern a little bit about and think about more intentionally as moving forward in terms of the ministry, the prison ministry, and other just our lives as human beings, which I think what I'm going to talk about today will, I think, be helpful with regards to just thinking about us as humans in this world at this moment in time, but also how it affects the various ministries that we're a part of, where we work, where we live, who we interact with, etc. And so, so I'm hoping I can provide a few pieces of information that you'll find helpful this morning or this afternoon, wherever you're located. So I'm gonna, before I get going, I want to just, in terms of some of the content, I want to just sort of remind, this from the Jubilee of Prisoners Mass, and this past December, and I thought what Pope Leo said here was really important to sort of ground us in this work and in this ministry. Beautiful flowers spring forth from the hard ground of sin and suffering, and I like that. I think about this idea, this notion of the the rose that grows from the concrete, if you will, and seeing ourselves and others, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So I want to kind of ground us in that idea of what this means in terms of who we're working with, regardless of who that is, who we're doing ministry with, regardless of where it is, and reflecting this idea of this the beautiful flowers and the rose that grows from concrete. When I think about the issue of humility, I think C.S. Lewis always comes to mind for me, and he said what you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you are standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. And so, I think, for the short time I have with you, I'm hoping that, you sort of take a moment to kind of do a self inventory, if you will. I always say that, good, well-intentioned individuals sometimes can unintentionally violate others. I'm sure you've heard the saying, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And so I think good intentions are important, and I think it's a good foundation for us to have in our work. But I think we also need to do a little bit more to make sure that we're not, with our good intentions, potentially unintentionally maybe violating or oppressing further others in the work that we're trying to do. And so I want to kind of ground us in this as well. So in doing that, I want to just give you a snapshot about who I am. So these are the various different aspects of my identity that are really salient and kind of create the person that you see before you this today. These are all different aspects of my identity that are important to me. I want to highlight two though that I think are really really kind of ground a little bit about sort of the work that I do and how I think about the work that I do and the perspectives that I'm coming from. And so Catholic and Mexican American have probably been the two most salient sociocultural identities that have really resonated with me throughout most of my life. I always tell folks that I grew up in a household where prayer and protest existed simultaneously, and so when I talk about this work, when I talk about helping us see ourselves in others, helping us, love our neighbor, welcome the stranger. It's really coming from those foundations. I mean, the idea of humility. I talk about humility in my work as a psychologist and have for a very long time. But that really was the genesis of that really came from my religious and spiritual foundations as a Catholic Christian Mexican American, and the idea of protest. I think to understand sometimes the work that I do, you have to be able to hold kind of two what might be somewhat contradictory perspectives together in some ways at the same time, and that is to celebrate. I think the place where I live, to celebrate, Catholicism, and also at times to sort of critique it. It's sort of how I show I love and care for both this country and also for both, my faith and what it and where it's rooted and where it's going and what it should look like at different times. So I say all that to say that you could have 10 other people talk about this issue, and you might get slightly different variations of what that looks like or how people talk about it. And so my talk with you today is not value free, it's very value laden. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's less legitimate, less valid, less reliable. It just means it's coming from my lived experiences and kind of how I see the world and how I make sense of it. And so I want you to keep that in mind as I kind of talk a little bit about some of what it means to be culturally humble and humility in the work that we're doing together and that you will do in your prison ministry. I want to share a short story with you as I get started. This is from, I can't remember if this is from a Lenten prayer book or from about 8 or 9 years ago. This was something that I read that I wanted to share. I always share this when I talk about humility, and it starts with Romans 10:12. There's no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all. This story might be a trigger for some folks, and so I just want to kind of make sure you kind of keep that in mind. It can be hard to hear, but I think it's also really relevant, and I think it really speaks to this idea of humility. During the war in Sarajevo, a reporter saw a child being shot, and he rushed to the man cradling her. As the man carried her, The reporter guided them to his car and sped off to a hospital. Hurry, the man urged. My child is still alive. A moment later, he pleaded, Hurry, my child is still breathing. A little later, Please, my child is still warm. Although the reporter drove quickly, the little girl died. In sadness, the man said, I must now go tell her father that his child is dead. He will be heartbroken. The reporter stood speechless. Looking at the grieving man, he said, I thought she was your child. And the man replied, No, but aren't they all our children? And so I just want to ask if you will, if you can maybe share in the chat just anything that comes up for you or that stood out to you in that story. Just maybe just for first thing that comes to mind. Can I see the chat, Emily, by the way?
You can see the chat,
Okay.
but the participants won't be able to see each other's chat. So you can read things as they come in.
Okay.
Say them
Okay.
out
Yeah.
loud.
Yeah. If anyone feels called to write something in the chat just in terms of what that story, we are all connected as one. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? We are all one. Thank you, Mike. Yeah. I worry a little bit. Thank you, both of you. I worry a little bit. Unity among tragedy. Thank you, Father George. We are one big family. Thank you, Diana. Yes, thank you. I worry a little bit that at this moment in time we have forgotten that we belong to one another. And I think we're sort of at this crossroads, at this moment in time where, we can go in different directions. And so I think in many ways, when I think of the idea of humility, I think about Sister Joan Chittister, who said that humility has been replaced with humiliations in many ways. And I think that's sort of where we are at this moment in time. And so when I think about the paths that we have to take, I'm hoping that we, particularly us as in our Catholic ministries, are really kind of grounded in this idea of remembering that we belong to each other. When we look at our history here in the United States, anytime that we have worked together and joined forces together and collaborated, we have always been much more successful. And so I think we have to be reminded of that we're at this space now and this fork in the road. And I'm hoping that we head in that direction of remembering who we are and that we do belong to one another and always have and will continue to do so. And so I think I want to start there with the idea of humility because it's where I'm going to end in just a few minutes here. So when I think about the idea of humility, the Latin root for humility is humus or earth. It means earth or ground, and this sort of grounded semantic field of humility seems to converge with this idea of to face one's limitations without excessive shame. And I highlighted that because I think that's probably the most important aspect of around thinking about this idea of humility. It's like being able to understand that we all have limitations. There are all things that we don't know, we don't even know we don't know. And when we think about sort of the isms of the world, if you will, whether it's racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, pick an ism. Those are like the air that we breathe in the world, if you will. And if we're not actively working against sort of those isms, then we might unintentionally, unexpectedly, unknowingly perpetuate some of the very things that we're trying to work against and that we see and we don't like sometimes. And so, but that means to be able to do that in many ways, it means that we have to be able to face our own limitations without feeling shame about that and being able to sort of walk with others in those limitations and to grow and it also means having the right perspective of oneself, if you will, neither too low nor too low and self-degrading or too high and full of pride. And so it's sort of finding that sort of that space in the middle somewhere. This lack of arrogance, combined with a curiosity to sort of learn about others, to being open to the values of others. Humility is knowing that One is dust from the earth, as we are all created, as I think some of you mentioned, this idea we are all one family, created in the image of God, knowing what I do not know, really realizing what I cannot know, and accepting the ways of God as a mystery that I cannot comprehend at times. And so I mentioned, we've substituted humiliations for humility. And I really want to highlight this idea that it's not about being perfect. It's about being honest with who you are, who we are as people. So we're not looking for perfection. We're not looking to always get it right. We're going to make mistakes. I always feel like if we're going to ask people to kind of go inward and take a look at themselves and face their maybe limitations and biases and shortcomings, I think we need to be there when they fall down to help pick them back up in many ways. So I think honesty about who we are, where we come from, the things that influence us are incredibly important when we think about this idea of humility. And so, let me talk a little bit about how we kind of can begin to understand that a little bit better in some ways. I think this idea of unconscious and implicit bias is, I think, an important starting point. This isn't certainly everything, but I think it's a good starting point for us as people as we think about this process. And so, um, what do you see when you see this image? Can you just maybe a few of you write in the chat what you see when you see this image, and I will read those out loud. Half a face. Thank you, Emily. Mary also mentioned that Greg Boyle talks about cherished belonging as the healing power of a love and divided word. That's right. That's absolutely right. I love Father Greg Boyle. Okay, half a face. Anybody else? What else do you see here? Two different views. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mike. Anybody else? Sad eyes. Sad eyes. Okay. Thank you, Joanne. All right. Good. Yeah. This is two emotions. My brother. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Familiar and yet unknown. Yes. Thank you. Yes. 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 All excellent. Thank you. Yes. This isn't. I get a lot of things. I get in the age of AI, sometimes I get that this is sort of AI generated and it's been cropped. It's been I get all kinds of things, but this is an optical illusion. And so it's two. It's looking sideways and looking forward, and so it's that optical illusion. Why is this important? Well, our mind sometimes has a really hard time reconciling two competing, possibly conflicting pieces of information. We just don't do that well. We don't do well with the both and sometimes. We do a lot better with the either or most of the time. Our mind has a hard time cognitively consolidating sometimes that information. And I think when we are faced with this sort of two competing, possibly conflicting pieces of information, we sort of consolidate that information in the quickest, easiest, most efficient way for us that makes us feel more comfortable. And so when we do that, sometimes we're distancing ourselves from the very thing that we might need to lean into. And so I think when we're faced with those conflicting, competing, pieces of information that we're not sure what to do with, I think what's important for us is to not lean into that discomfort. I think a lot of times in this work, when we're working with those on the periphery, on those on the margins, that Pope Francis did a phenomenal job reminding us of where we find God. When we're on those margins, on the periphery in many ways, sometimes it can be a little unsettling, a little bit discomforting. When we go to the prisons, I've been to numerous prisons as a psychologist, I go into prisons to do evaluations to try to humanize these individuals for the legal system in many ways. I've been to San Quentin, where Father George is several times on death row. And so those situations can make us feel a little bit unease at times, uncomfortable at times. And so how can we what do we need to do to be able to sort of lean into that comfort and be comfortable being uncomfortable sometimes? And I think the other thing that's important for us to do is to own our impact, even if that was not what our intent was. Because sometimes it's like I said, good, well-intentioned individuals might unintentionally violate others at times. And so we may get feedback, we may hear things, we may be surprised that how we're being perceived and how we're coming across. And even if that's not our intent, even if that's not what we're trying to do, I think it's important for us to accept that, to own that, and to understand that from another sort of set of eyes, from other perspectives in many ways, which is good information for us as we think about kind of growing in our awareness of who we are, what's our location in all this, and how we're coming at this work in many ways. There are three beliefs that are really hard for most people to believe, and that is that, much of our mental life occurs outside of our awareness. How many of you get up in the morning, brush your teeth, you have your routine and you can do that without even thinking about it? How many of you can drive to the local store or drive home from work because you've done it so many times that you don't even have to think about what the steps are? Much of our lives occurs outside of our conscious awareness. It's just automatic in many ways, and unconscious, if you will. And so that's a hard. That's sometimes that's we have to kind of when I remind people of that, they kind of take a moment and go, that, yeah, that's right. But sometimes that's hard for us to imagine. It's also what we know is that sometimes the unconscious thoughts that we have that sometimes we may not be aware of may contradict our sort of conscious, more openly stated beliefs. So we may say one thing, but maybe our behavior or how we're responding, or maybe what we sort of say at times may contradict what we've said at this other space and time, or how we've responded over here, what we've done. And so we know that there's sometimes contradictions from what we might say and do at times, and kind of what those unconscious biases and thoughts we might have are. And then our behaviors and actions are shaped by both our intentional but also our unconscious, unintentional thoughts and implicit thoughts, if you will, oftentimes. And so, what is implicit bias? Well, it comes from these overlearned associations that can be rooted in early childhood experiences, socialization processes, repeated personal experiences with communities, with individuals, what we see on the media. I think the media and sources of like that, I think give us half truth sometimes. I think we are as influenced as much by what we're not told as much by what we do hear and what we are told at times. I think those cultural representations of communities can really impact and influence how we see others. It's sort of this judgment, this bias and judgment that kind of comes from our sort of thoughts that kind of operate below our level of sort of conscious awareness, if you will, in many ways. And so here's what I would say about this. We all have biases. Every single one of us has biases. And we have the impact though of those biases really depends on what roles we play in society, what our ministry might be, what places we occupy in the church, in the workforce, in the academic institution, whatever it may be. And so all of us have biases. We know that biases show up most around external characteristics like racial bias, which can show up as sort of racism at times, gender bias, which can show up as kind of sexism, body size. We know that from research that bias shows up a lot around body size, LGBTQ plus communities, non-residents of the US, which we're seeing a lot of at this moment in time. And this may not surprise some of you, it may surprise some of you, but here in the US, some of our strongest negative biases are towards older adults, followed by people who have body image, body size issues, larger body size issues, and concerns and challenges. And so I always tell people ableism is still the one ism in the United States that continues to be, I think, acceptable in some ways. But that's where bias shows up the most. Here, these last two bullet points I think are really important. So what we know about our unconscious implicit biases is that those are a much stronger predictor of day-to-day behavior than our known biases, our known assumptions, our known prejudices, if you will, because much of our behavior and thoughts, as I mentioned, are automatic. So I think it's important to kind of for me to restate that much of our sort of day-to-day behavior is actually being is being driven by those sort of unconscious, maybe unknown biases that we may have. And then our implicit biases are more likely to show up when we're trying to multitask and do multiple things, when we might feel a little bit stressed and overwhelmed, and when we're under high threat. And if I could see all of you, I would ask you how many of you have felt any one of these at any given time? How many of you feel that maybe right now? How many of you are trying to maybe multitask right now? I'm not offended, by the way, if you're doing that, but I think it's just it's part of our kind of like daily life for some of us and for some of the work that we do and whatnot. So if we think about it from that perspective, we know that our sort of we're relying on automatic and unconscious thoughts to sort of determine and drive kind of what we do and how we do things. And so if we all begin at the same place, just a few examples, crime and circumstances being equal, comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, blacks, African Americans, and some other subgroups of Latinx communities are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, receive poorer plea deals, convicted, receive longer sentences, receive the death penalty, be declined probation, and be declined a pardon. In the U.S. today, there are more African American men in jail than were enslaved in 1850. That should get us to pause for a minute. I think that's a pretty astounding statistic and one that I think is pretty significant. So we should pause when we see that and go like, something's not right here. Something's not right here. If we look at education, previous performance being equal, K through 12 teachers continue to have lower expectations and display less social comfort at times with African American black students and some Latinx students over their white counterparts. I have a colleague of mine who does some research you know, one of the things that he has found is that when young African American adolescent boys are in trouble, the punishment that they receive is commiserate is consistent, more consistent with sort of adult African American, behaviors and punishment, if you will. And so, in many ways, when we see what's happening in the world, sometimes it's like we treat our sort of black men as kids and our black young kids as sort of adults and men in many ways. There's sort of a problem there. I think this is true for other communities as well, but particularly with our African American black communities, I think we see that a lot happening in many ways. And we're seeing that now in many ways with our immigrant communities, which is happening quite a bit. If we look at criminal sentencing and implicit bias, African Americans represent roughly about 15.2% of the general population and are roughly 38.3% of the prison population. If we compare that to their white counterparts, whites in 2025 made up about 57, just over 57% of the prison population, while sort of making up just over 57% or almost 58% of the general population. And so there's a disparity there. There's a gap there that I think we have to pay attention to and be mindful of when we think about what's happening and how this is affecting people and their families. So what do we need? How can we begin to identify our implicit bias? Just a couple things that I want to mention. So if you've not taken the implicit association test, the IAT test, it's out of Harvard, and I think UCLA also has some really good resources. Happy to send those to Emily so she can pass those along. The implicit association test is not a perfect test, but it does correlate with various implicit and biases and explicit behaviors. I found it to be a good sort of starting place for a lot of folks. So think about that as a starting place. I would also, something really simple that you can do is talk to a trusted colleague, a friend, a family member. Think about someone in your life who knows you really well. Give them a pass to give you honest feedback about any biases they think you might have. Sometimes it can be hard to hear that, but try to listen without becoming defensive. Sometimes other people can see and know our biases before we even do. So just a couple of things to kind of, keep that in mind as you're starting to think about what that might look like for you and where they show up for you. And so We know from research, Pat Devine and her colleagues have done some really good research on unconscious biases, how to eliminate them. We know that number one, we have to be aware of the biases that we have. Number one, we have to be concerned about the consequences of our biases before we have any motivation to actually try to eliminate them. And then number three, we need to know when our biased responses are likely to occur. And then what we can do to replace those biases with an alternative and more kind of consistent response that's consistent with what our goals are, with what our ministry is, and what we're hoping to accomplish. And so she's come up with these really great strategies that I think we use these strategies in different ways for when we do trainings, but these are just I'm not going to go through all of these, but just I'll just kind of name them. It's like stereotype replacement, counter stereotypic imaging, individuating, perspective taking, and contact. I want to highlight one of those for you today, the perspective taking. I think it's really helpful. And it's a very short video, 3 minutes. I know I'm running kind of close to my time. I know Father George gave me a little flex, so I might take a little flex, but I want to show this one video. It's just 3 minutes long. I want to say it's kind of one of those things that might be triggering for folks. So just kind of keep that in mind. But I want to play this short video for you if I can.
We actually have a line that we do at our house. We practice this thing. What is it?
I'm Ariel Sky Williams. I'm 8 years old. I'm unarmed and I have nothing that will hurt you.
It's just kind of a thing we practice at our house. There are great police officers out there. There's also some police officers who are not so good.
And my fear is that you run across one of those bad ones.
For some reason, people of color have always been a target by the police.
Before they became a policeman, they were a person. And that person took all their ideas and all their thoughts and all their prejudice into their job.
Why would a police officer assume that you did something bad?
Maybe because of my skin color.
I remember being put in handcuffs for something that had nothing to do with me. I was literally walking in the mall. Cops slammed me on the ground, busted my lip, chipped my tooth. That actually made me really mad.
How about the time they pulled us over with me in the car and arrested me and left all of you guys sitting in the car and nobody knew how to drive on the side of the road because the bumper on the car was kind of hanging off?
No.
You know, we live in Puyallup. There's people that don't even have a bumper on their car.
My rear brake light wasn't working. And I got to my destination and they were working.
I was about your age. Actually, they grabbed me.
Why?
I didn't know at the time. They just grabbed me. They threw me onto the police car.
I got tased that time. That time they tased me because they said I wasn't complying.
Ariel, are you okay?
What's wrong, baby? I'm okay. I'm alive, all right? Every day I get to see you. I get to do this, right? All right, well, hold on. This is right. You good? Hey, you make me cry.
You have to be careful when you're out there in this world because this world's not going to always be honest or fair to you.
So if anyone feels comfortable putting a couple of just reactions or what came up for you when seeing that short clip, I would appreciate it. I know I've seen this, obviously I've used this a lot. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, heartbreaking. Every time I see it, it continues to, it always hits me and it's hard to see, but I think it's also so profound because I think it really helps, you know, I hope it helps kind of shift and kind of gives us another perspective. I think sometimes it's easy for us to make assumptions and yeah, Emily, thank you. Thinking about those families having conversations now. Yeah, sometimes I get when I've shown this before, sometimes I get people who've gotten upset with me because they said that these parents are sort of making these kids victims, and I would disagree with that. I think it's like what Emily said. I'm a Mexican American dad with two daughters who have indigenous names, and so I'll tell you, my wife and I, we feel like if we are not having some conversations with our kids, we're not preparing them for what they're going to encounter in the world, and how we can do, and how we can sort of help to prepare them for that, but not prepare them for that to create more division, but to create more to understand and be better prepared. And so I could say a lot more about that and what that looks like. And I appreciate Harry and Bob. Really appreciate your sort of comments about, being a white middle class individual and kind of never having had the conversation. Yeah, I think that's part of the some of the privilege. We all have privileges, by the way, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but what can we do with those privileges that can really help us kind of do good, work towards the common good, with others in many ways. And so when I think about this, I think not only about empathy, which I think is perspective taking, but I think about compassion. And when I think about compassion, particularly from a ministry perspective, I think about this ability to suffer with another, to recognize the basic human experience of another's story and their lived experiences. It's this gentle attitude and deep attachment to another, especially in distress. And so when I go to the prisons to do evaluations, these are some good folks who found themselves in a bad situation sometimes. My heart hurts and breaks for them at times. And so they're in distress. I'm in distress with them. And yet I also have the privilege of leaving. So how do I find a rhythm in all that? So I think some things to ask ourselves. What are some characteristics and skills that you might have that could help or hinder you in conversations in your prison ministry? What specific topics in your prison ministry are most challenging for you? And how do you manage these challenging, strong emotions that may come up for you? And how do you manage disagreement and or conflict when you hear things that may not resonate with you or may be hard for you to hear? And so what can we do? A couple of things. I think it's important to focus on our sort of increasing awareness, continual personal and professional growth. Draw upon your own experiences as a foundation for empathy and compassion. Think about those differences, those different experiences, and reframing them and as opportunities for growth. Be aware of the tendency of either or comparative thinking, which can be I think a challenge. Check in with self and others. Think about when you're triggered by difference, or when you may have participated in triggering a sense of difference in someone else. What are your go-to strategies when you feel discomfort or unease in many ways? And always ask, what impact have I had on someone else? I just covered that because I'm trying to move through this here. I just have a couple more slides and I'll be done, Father George. So I want to end with this. I think sometimes we're those of us who have certain privileges, and we all have privileges. I have more privileges today than I ever have in my life. Sometimes we're allowed to keep ourselves a safe distance from things that can be challenging or are difficult for us in many ways. This is from Brian Stevenson's book In Just Mercy, and he's talking about seeing his grandmother. And he said every time he saw his grandmother would pull him in close and say, "You can't understand most of the important things from a distance, Brian. You have to get close." So I would ask you, as you think about this idea of humility, compassion, empathy, being aware of who we are, kind of knowing where we're located, as C.S. Lewis reminds us, sort of what things might we be keeping ourselves a safe distance from? Whether that's sometimes unknowingly, unconsciously, and how can we become more aware of that? And I think that's a good starting place for us in many ways. And so, what does it mean for us to be human and to do our ministries? I think it means that our experiences, the knowledge that we have gained, maybe the expertise that we've earned, we've sort of garnered along the way, doesn't eliminate us from being influenced by the things that matter to us, by the air that we breathe, by the isms in the air. We have to filter that air a little bit. and our lived experiences in general, our social status, the privileges of our personal identities, we are not immune to that because we have good intention and because we have good experiences and good knowledge. We are as vulnerable and as impacted as anybody else is. And we're not indifferent observers whose personal biases and a priori commitments, emotional involvement are absent in our ministry. And so I think that's important to be mindful of. And as I end, I want to, there's an ancient Mayan greeting called In Lakesh Alakin. I think it's a good place for me. It's where I started, it's where I want to end. I am you and you are me. You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. And I think that's a good grounding and remembering sort of even our sort of in our Catholic ministry, Scripture, the Gospels tell us this. Our ministry teaches us how to think about this. Our charisms, which are important to sort of pull from in this work, and our compassion and empathy, I think, help us kind of ground and remember that we belong to each other. And as Bob mentioned, I was talking to Bob earlier, when you walk into the prison, when you walk into see the homeless person, when you see the immigrant being detained, when you the abuse is happening, that you're seeing ourselves in those other people. Every encounter is an encounter with knowledge, even with people when we go to the prisons, the jails, wherever it may be. Every encounter is an encounter with knowledge, and we would do much better if we always saw ourselves in others. So I took a few extra minutes, Father George. I'm done though. I'm gonna stop there.
It looks like Father George might not be able to come on microphone right now.
Okay.
So please share your questions with us, and I can help call on folks, or you can call on them, Miguel. I had a question coming to mind, especially at the end here, as you're helping us to kind of imagine some scenarios. I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that. How might implicit bias show up in ministry in a prison or jail setting? Are there any examples that come to mind for you that of what that might look like and how it could be harmful?
Yeah, yeah. I think sometimes, I think based on what an individual may have done to find themselves in prison, in prison or in jail, I think sometimes when if we don't know the story, I think most things out of context are going to look a little bit off and odd to a certain degree. And so I always tell people, listen to people's stories. And I like to compare listen and silent. Listen and silent are anagrams for each other. And I think a lot of times in ministry, active listening and discernment are so critical. And so I like to think about comparing listening and silent, which are anagrams, same letters, just different words, but I think they really resonate so much. How can we listen, active listen, and be silent and hear that, listen to maybe what's not being said? I think also oftentimes it's important to know what our stimulus value might be. And what I mean by our stimulus value is like when I show up someplace, even when you see me on the screen right now, it is possible that people start to generate a lot of ideas about maybe who they think I might be or maybe where I come from. Now, if I bring that to your awareness, you're going to tell me that you don't do that to a certain degree and that you try to be and that's true. And that's what we have to do. We have to kind of bring it to our awareness. But when you look at sort of everyday behavior, we are automatically formulating kind of ideas about who things are, who people are, what things are, their life stories potentially. And, maybe we're not kind of jumping to sort of far conclusions, but I think it's an automatic human process. And so when you hear stories about what people have done, I think sometimes it can be easy to sort of have an automatic unconscious thought that come to mind that may not necessarily, I think, validate the humanity of the other person that sits before you. So, someone who, may have, you know, uh, caused an accident because of drunk driving and killed other people, which is, vehicular manslaughter, or be convicted of homicide, or or when we see the things that I love what Gustavo Gutierrez said about the poor. He says that systems, the systems that we exist in, force people into poverty and keep people there in many ways. And so I think if we can think about it, if we think about our Catholic social teaching, the preferential option for the poor, not just economically, but those on the margins, it's like, what are the situations and circumstances that people have found themselves in that maybe have led them to make some decisions and choices that weren't always maybe the most advantageous for them? And how can we see through the outcome of what happened and where they have landed and understand the origins and the lived experiences and the reality of those individuals? Now, what's important to know is that when you show up based on how other people might perceive you, they may they may not tell you certain things. They may be hesitant to tell you certain things. There's this process that's called, it's like sometimes if people think you're going to perceive them in a particular way, they may try to come across in a particular way to you so that you don't see them in that way. And so how let me say it again. So when people perceive you to sort of maybe look a certain way, they're going to assume that you have a certain way of thinking about them or maybe seeing them in a particular way. And so that stimulus value of when you show up someplace, what do you think people are going to see when they see you, and how might that impact what they choose to tell you, not tell you, etc. So that you can so that in some ways, you can understand what that looks like. Now, I love what Mike said around not asking about the crime. I think that's great. I think that's fine. How can you, and that may be, that's a good, I think that's a good process in many ways. Um, but I think I think this idea of stimulus value, it's like, what might they not be telling you? I'll just use Mike as an example, based on how you show up and what you and how they might be perceiving you. And I think that's important to think about. That stimulus value. I think sometimes the way people look, I think sometimes, the stories they have, it might be easy to sort of generate sort of judgments or preconceived notions or ideas about who they are. So I think those are some general examples and ideas, Emily, that come to mind. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's sort of what's coming to mind as that question. So
Okay. Thanks. I don't know if you can hear me. I was having
I
some
can. Yeah, I
internet
thought I
issues.
thought I scared you away, Father Joy. I wasn't sure.
No, no. We only have time for maybe one more question here, and that is an observation really from Mike. When ministering, I intentionally don't ask nor don't want to know about the crime involved with an inmate for fear that my bias might kick in. For example, sex crimes around children. These biases are also manifested among other inmates. And I'm wondering, to add to that a little bit, since we work in a system that's built on bias, how would we address, say, either inmates or the COs we work with in a gentle way to maybe explore their own biases?
I think if we're aware of that and we're entering in understanding that, I think by modeling in many ways, by gently reframing, by gently sort of calling in, if you will, Father George. I think sometimes when we see people who might be doing things that we think may not be okay or may be unintentionally kind of offensive to others in many ways, there's this idea of wanting to call people out in many ways. I think what I always like to tell people is, how can we call people in and call on them to do better in many ways? So how can we call somebody in to maybe see this individual in a different way? Or how can we share our perspective that may actually reflect a different viewpoint or a different way of understanding, how people might see, or how they might think about this. And also, I think naming it. I think naming those things, particularly for inmates, I think naming the systemic challenges can be very validating and affirming in many way. I don't think, look, if we see what's happening. I think it's okay for us to to name that. I think sometimes that can be very validating for inmates because I think sometimes in the system it can make inmates feel like they're having um, um, sort of these reactions that are not okay, but they're really in systems that are not okay, and they might be having very normal reactions to unhealthy systems at times. So how can we kind of shape that a little bit, Jeremy? I don't know if that's helpful, Father George, but that's sort of what comes to mind. Yeah, I
Well,
think,
it is.
yeah,
Yeah. And I'm thinking, we can't exactly expect incarcerated people to not have the same reactions that anybody else has, or that they somehow have a responsibility to deal with them more than we do,
that's right.
which maybe ties into perhaps the last comment here is from Bob. Really just a simple question. Can you give maybe one suggestion for how do we deal with the inherent uncomfortableness of engaging with our implicit biases?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing is first off, I think really trying to sort of pay attention to when you feel sort of triggered, if you will. When do you feel most triggered? I'm just going to use Bob as Bob. When do you feel most not just sort of when you're in sort of the prison ministry, but just in general, like when you're kind of operating in life, when you hear something, when you see something, what are the things that maybe trigger you? I think is sort of a first step of kind of trying to be aware of what am I being triggered by? Because I think that's a first step to understanding what may be the things that you respond to in ways that you may not be aware of. And then when you understand what that maybe that trigger is, kind of pay attention to like, did something shift for me? Do I feel different physiologically? Do I feel a change in my body? And then what do you do when you feel that way? What is your sort of automatic response? I think it's around slowing down, kind of pausing a minute and reflect. I think that's part of our work, is that intentional work in some ways. And so definitely not, don't ignore them. We got to face them in many ways. And I think that's important. So.
Well, thank you for sharing such critically important themes with us today, Dr. Gallardo. In conclusion, I'd like to just mention what's coming up in the future with CPMC. As you know, Lent begins a week from today on February 18th, 2026. And during Lent, CPMC has several special initiatives planned. One is on Saturday, March 7th. We invite you to join us online or to gather in person with your local ministry team to our Lenten Day of Reflection. We're going to be led in prayer and sharing by Deacon Arthur Miller, who is a regular contributor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' daily reflection videos. And he's a well-known minister, author, and preacher. And also by Sister Melinda Pellerin, who is a sister of St. Joseph, who has a long history of accompanying women impacted by incarceration and addiction. So you can register online as an individual, or you can request more information about planning as an in-person gathering with the group. And that's here on the screen. Our next monthly learning series program will be on March 11th. The topic will be a Lenten invitation for all Catholics, the forgotten work of mercy. And this is an opportunity for you to invite someone new who you know to might consider this ministry. You can visit our registration page to sign up, and it will send you the link and downloadable materials you can share with your parish or your diocese. Please follow us on social media. We now have these new 1-minute Lenten video reflections that connect the weekly readings to prison and jail ministry and detention ministry. And these feature our CPM staff and also special guests from around the country. And you can find them on Facebook, on YouTube, on these sites here. And of course, this is on our webpage as well. And finally, when this webinar ends, you'll be redirected to a short survey about today's event. And it's really important that we get your feedback for these programs. So please take a moment and let us know what you think and fill out the survey. We thank you for your time. We thank you for joining us today. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Gallardo, for your work and for what you shared today. It was a wonderful presentation. And we'll see you all next month. God bless you all.
Thank you. Good day. Bye.